Woe be unto him who opens one of the 7 gateways to hell, because through that gateway, evil will invade the world.
Valentine's Day is a curse that'll live on, and no one will know as the years come and go of the horror from long time ago. In this little town, when the 14th comes round, there's a silence and fear in the air. Remember the morn that the legend was born, all the shock and the horror was there. Oh, the legend, they say, on a Valentine's Day is a curse that'll live on, and no one will know as the years come and go of the horror from long time ago. And no one will know as the years come and go of the horror from long time ago.
All right, I'm here with Joe Rubin from Vinegar Syndrome, and we're here to talk about 1981's The Nesting. How you doing, Joe?
Pretty good. It's the start of the cold season in LA.
Are you a fan of the cold season in LA?
Definitely more than the cold season in New York.
I bet. Ohio doesn't really have a cold season anymore. It has a cold day, then a hot day, then a cold day.
Yeah, that's the global warming.
Yeah, it's about right. It's trying to kill us. But yeah, this is kind of a strange one. When I sent over the list of the ones that I was wondering you'd be interested in, I know why you picked The Nesting, but I bet you can tell the audience why you picked it. But it's an oddball movie. It's not really one of the, I guess you'd say, the cream of the crop, but I guess it has some interesting behind the scenes stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was actually like a lot of movies that ended up coming out in the early 80s, shot in 79. So it's sort of a cheat to call this a 1981 film, seeing as it was shot in 79, but then delayed uh, for release until 81.
That tends to happen a lot with them.
Yeah, it's weird. I was actually looking at Butcher Baker Nightmare Maker, which was shot in I think May or June of 1980, and didn't come out until like very late 81, but didn't have a wide release until 82. So there seemed to be a lot of films that were made in 79 and 80 that inexplicably got delayed for a year or more.
Same thing with the Demon. When you look up the Demon with Cameron Mitchell, it's listed as 79, but some people list it as 80 and 81 and all. Martin's another one. Martin's all over the place because people are listing the dates as like, oh, that was when they showed it in a barn to two people. It's like, is that really a screening?
Yeah.
So it's all over the place.
But yeah, that's also symptomatic of independent films of this period. Like many, because I've also been spending a lot of time in the last year looking through the box office magazine database, which is really helpful for trade ads and identifying when things were actually originally produced and being marketed. And you'll see all sorts of films that had earlier titles or were initially being released years in some cases before their eventual wide release.
Well, that also kind of changes the trajectory of like a lot of these movies too. Because if you look at the nesting and you're on paper and you're like 81, you're like, well, they had The Shining the year before. You have like Ghost Keeper the same year. You're like, is this kind of just inspired by like other haunted house movies like House by the Cemetery? But in reality, if it was starting to film in 79, it was actually kind of doing its own thing.
Yeah, and that's we just released Mother's Day, as you're aware.
Yeah.
And it turned up during the production of the extras that Mother's Day was shot a couple months after Friday the 13th in the same place, the same general vicinity. And there's a shot in Mother's Day that is almost identical to a shot in Friday the 13th because it was shot on the same road. And of course, neither production was aware of the other one.
Yeah.
But it's just like that's the sort of strange coincidence that someone, watching one and then the other may have assumed that someone saw the first one to come out and decided I'm going to rip off that shot or shoot in the same place or some other kind of inaccurate conjecture just based on when films were released relative to when they were made.
Yeah, it's the same if you bring up To All Good Night 1980. That movie was ahead of the big slasher boom, and it probably wasn't even made in 80. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure when those Sandy Cove movies were made because there were 4 of them. To All a Good Night, Home Sweet Home, Terror on Tour, and Mented. They were all shot back to back.
So I'm gonna have to say that To All Good Night stands as the best one of the bunch for me.
I would go with Demented. I think Demented is just...
Dementus does have the huge porn connection with it, right? With the actors in there and everything too.
Yeah, Harry Reams is in it.
Yeah,
but he's also into All a Good Night. He plays the pilot.
Yeah, he does. He does play the pilot, and he looks very suspicious. You think he's the killer the whole movie. And this one has a lot of the connections to porn as well, right?
Yeah, but not in the cast side, and only on the production side. So Armand Weston, who directed it, was a very well-respected and acclaimed director of sex films. He made a number of really significant kind of horror and thriller crossover films. It wasn't his first film, but his first big film was Defiance, which starred Gene Jennings, who would eventually marry Joe Spinell. And also Fred Lincoln. And then he made The Taking of Christina, which was loosely inspired by the Inez Garcia kidnapping case. This is sort of a spoiler if anyone hasn't seen the film, but the real case, which is sort of replicated in the film, is Garcia was kidnapped and basically feigned Stockholm Syndrome and manipulated her kidnappers into thinking that she actually loved them. and so they let her go home to get her stuff to go with them, and she showed back up with a gun and shot him. So yeah, that was his not his second film, but his second big film. His first sort of bigger film is a movie called Personals, which is an anthology about personal sex ads, which mixes reenactments and semi-legitimate interviews with people who placed ads. But yeah, then he made a film called Expose Me Lovely, which, despite the title kind of riffing on the recent release of Farewell My Lovely, which was released a few months earlier, is actually a really solid standalone detective murder mystery with some giallo elements and again a good killer reveal twist. Then he made a film called Takeoff, which was very tonally different and a comedy. Again, sort of an anthology based on the picture of Dorian Gray, where the Dorian Gray character, whose name is Darren Blue, explains his life and experiences from the 20s through the 60s, and it's sort of uncharacteristically sweet for an Armand Weston film, which were for the most part kind of mean-spirited and downbeat. So the producers of Expose Me Lovely were Sam Lake and Robert Sumner, who are the producers of The Nesting. And I don't know why they made The Nesting or what their intentions were with making The Nesting, but The Nesting was originally called Phobia. And because of John Huston film of
1980.
They were, and this is something that I'm not entirely clear on, and I'm not sure if they were threatened by Paramount and forced to change the name, or like in the case of Last House on Dead End Street, which was originally called The Funhouse, where the producer explained that Universal actually paid him to stop calling it The Funhouse because they wanted to produce the Tobe Hooper film. They didn't want to have a film called The Funhouse. There was also a horror film coming out at the same time. I'm not clear if the reason that Phobia was changed to The Nesting was because of a threat from Paramount or a payoff from Paramount. But in any case, the film was shot in the late summer of 1979, September approximately, near Tarrytown, New York, which is where Jeff was randomly, and was publicized as Phobia, was initially sold as Phobia, but never distributed as Phobia, and then it seemed to just sort of it was announced in 79, it was first publicized in 80, and then it just seemed to have disappeared until the spring of 81 when it actually finally came out as The Nesting.
So that's strange. It's kind of funny though, if they would have never made them change the name from The Funhouse and they would have just found their own title change, they would have had no problems with the BBC and the Video Nasty list, because everyone knows that they thought The Funhouse was the Video Nasty, but it was really Last House on Dead End Street. And they just kind of walked away scot-free on that because the people doing that were morons.
Yeah, that's and what I think, and I'm no expert in video nasties to any degree, but I think that The Nesting made it onto, not of course the main list, but like on like the third tier list.
It's on there for sure. I don't know if it landed on the second or third, but it's definitely listed among the video nasties. Probably wrongfully so. Honestly, I don't know.
Majority of them, like, if you watch some of these things, like I Miss You, Hugs and Kisses, which is actually a pretty good film, I thought.
It's not bad.
But, it has one murder sequence and otherwise it's a drama.
It's like a TV movie
with
a gore scene.
Yeah, with one gore scene.
I think the alternative title probably got it on the list. It was I Hate Your Guts. So they see that fight for your life, I hate your guts, I spit on your grave, and they're like, put it in there, get it in there. It's on the list. You know what I mean?
So, well, I'm curious then, what did you think of Nestings? I saw your Letterboxd star rating, but
I did enjoy it. I'm looking at a 6.5, a 7, or something like that. I didn't expect much because here's what it is. The Nesting and Final Exam were movies that are probably like the biggest ones from 81 that I had never watched for some reason. The real reason is everyone's like, oh, they're dull, they're boring, they're crappy. So I buy them 3 or 4 times and never watch them. And then eventually I put this in. I was like, this is perfectly serviceable. Now, instead of being more of a slasher movie, which I don't know why I had the idea that it was, it's more of a haunted house story, but I would put it more along the lines of like a House of Psychotic Women movie, right? Where it's kind of like the mental anguish and things like that. There is a haunted house aspect, but it reminds me of other movies I've seen, but I can't put my finger on it. Kind of like the flashbacks and everything. Maybe Rosemary's Killer, because it has a lot of the flashbacks in the beginning and stuff like that.
Also a movie made by porn people.
Yeah, in 81 as well.
So, yeah, the Nesting, this is the first time I've watched it probably since like 2010. And I didn't enjoy it when I watched it in 2010, or whenever it was. And I actually did really like it this time. I didn't love it, but I was impressed with more of the stylistic touches. And even though it's way too long, it does not need to be 103 minutes, there are sequences in it, like when she's being chased around the empty farm kind of endlessly by the crazy redneck.
Abby. That's the best character in the movie is Abby. He's Abner.
I liked how slow that everything was. Like, it didn't feel, like, okay, get to the point. Like, there's a car chase scene. He crashes. She gets out. She goes over. She looks at him. He wakes up. He chases her around. She goes. This is probably like a 10-minute sequence that, it has a fine payoff, I guess. But it's like this really long scene, and that's the sort of thing that otherwise would have bored me, but I felt like it worked. Like film had much more of a laid back feel. And what I actually kept on thinking of, also 81, is Ghost Story,
which is a good film too. It's very laid back.
Yeah, it's like another sort of sleepy New England, what's the mystery here of the haunted house? And again, very much like Ghost Story, it's about a bunch of old men who are trying to cover up their own crime from decades earlier that the ghosts are now avenging.
Yeah, I think the guy actually plays Abner. I think he was probably the most memorable performance. I won't say best because I do enjoy his performance, especially there was a distinct scene that I noticed when he was chasing her. I don't know if it's supposedly the head injury or he's just like act like a crazed sexual rapist, but he was literally like this. He stuck his tongue out like a 7-year-old grandpa. And I was like, so that's the choice we're going with. You're running around sticking your tongue out. And I just thought that was hilarious. And like you said, the chase is very mundane. It's a mundane chase, but the build up to the actual chase, when she goes in the house and he's like, you want to sit or stand? All his dialogue is really intense. That whole scene's really creepy. She should have known better not to go in that guy's house. Like, he's taking a crap when she goes in. Oh, of course you'd come here, Frank, when I'm taking a dump. It's like, I don't know. That whole scene is actually probably the best stuff in the movie for me, that up to the chase scene and the scythe, of course, the scythe.
See, one of the cats is active in the background.
Yeah, that's Claudio.
So, yeah, I mean, look, if you want to judge the logic of the Nesting storyline, like, why doesn't she leave the house after her doctor gets his eye impaled? Like, there's, so many illogical things about the motivations of characters in movies like this. Like, I can't really read it. Well, yeah, of course. Yes, if this were a real scenario, she wouldn't have been like, yeah, I'm going to go into this, like, inbred, hick-looking shack with the guy who just announced it to the shit.
And it seems like every guy in the movie is a rapist or would be rapist. Like, the Frank guy threw me off because, like, obviously he hates big city folk, but then he's like, I know what you want, lady. I was like, wow, that's kind of surprising. I mean, like, maybe the porn people that was like, we got to get like that. The transitions to like any sexual nature is just not very good on their part. But That was just, it seemed out of character even for a villain, you know?
Yeah, I'm not gonna. So the film was also co-written by Weston and his writing partner Daria Price, and she'd also co-written Takeoff, and I don't maybe Expose Me Lovely as well. I can't remember that though. But she's still around, and she's subsequently worked in mainstream stuff. Weston actually died a few years after the film was made. This was the final film he directed.
Do you think he would have followed through with more feature-length films, less, or would have went back to the porn industry?
And again, it's unclear as to why. He was a very well-respected director of sex films, and he was also a poster artist. He was his background was as like a fine artist. He was a painter, and so he paint like the poster image for The Nesting. He painted it. So he was certainly aware of film and art and all of that in a very formal, intellectual capacity. And I read an interview with him years ago in a magazine, a sex magazine, where he was talking about how he enjoyed making sex films because he was interested in exploring stories and characters and their motivations in terms of sexuality. But he found that directing sex films was also creatively stifling because there was the obligation to include a sex scene every 5 to 10 minutes, and therefore it could become difficult to really communicate ideas because they could get lost in frequent sex scenes. So, from that interview, I think it can be inferred that he did have an ambition of not making sex films and going into conventional films. But why they made this, and why Sumner and Lake, who did not produce, they both worked in film prior to hardcore, so they were producing softcore movies in the 60s. But why they decided in 79 we're going to make this clearly mainstream oriented horror film. Like, it's not, there's a bit of nudity. Like, there's the random scene where the is looking at herself topless in a mirror, and then the big brothel flashback at the end with a little bit of nudity, but it's not really a sex oriented film by any stretch. Like, the house was a brothel, so there's like the implication of sex, but there's not sex scenes, and the attempted rapes go nowhere. It's just sort of a setup. So this clearly wasn't an attempt to do like what was sometimes also done by sex directors, where they would shoot an R-rated and an X-rated version of the same film to have multiple markets covered, and then shoot like a sex version of a scene and then the same scene again with no sex in it. So this was clearly not an attempt to make a big budget sex film, but also would have an R-rated version. So yeah, why they made this film, don't know.
It's strange. Like, he also did do, I don't know how his porno films are, but he could have very well just added sex scenes in this movie and kept the runtime and just added them like Joe D'Amato did for Porno Holocaust, or the Daydream film from the same year, the Japanese one. These are regular movies almost, but then when the sex scenes happen, so they're running hour and a half, and then there's 20 to 25 minutes of sex scenes, which makes all those movies just run way too long instead of cutting some of the sex or cutting some of the actual film. You don't need both, but they just kind of wear out their welcome, as enjoyable as some might be,
So, oh my God, what else is there to say
about this one? I mean, like, the end massacre is actually pretty large. Like, I didn't expect it. It seemed to go on for absolutely forever.
Yeah, well, actually, that is something else that, and I would recommend his sex films. I think that they're all well worth watching. They're not. I would say that Expose Me Lovely might be, as a film, the most interesting, just because, again, it has like a sort of murder mystery giallo-esque structure to it. But all of his sex films, I think, are a cut above the average, and especially Defiance, Taking of Christina, and Expose Me Lovely, all very nicely fit into a horror film adjacent mindset. They all have, not Defiance, because Defiance doesn't have any murders in it, but Defiance definitely plays like a horror film in terms of the lighting, and the first act is all set in an asylum, and very it has a really nice sense of atmosphere. And the second half is the last hour of it basically is all in like this sort of, if it were a horror movie, it would be like a haunted house or like a spooky house. I mean, that's kind of the point. And then, taking Christina, which is a straight drama with thriller elements, it still has a throat slashing sequence in it, and then the final shootings are like nice squib explosions. So, he was into definitely making sex films that had horror, thriller, and murder elements to them. So you see a lot of that in The Nesting, and The Nesting is also pretty downbeat. Like, there's no fun. There's no, sure, you can add them in comic relief to a degree, but I don't know that that's intended. That might just be like the unintended byproduct of the performance.
Yeah.
But like, I think his character and all of his actions, including like absurd things like the tongue coming out, are intended to be unnerving and off-putting, not funny. So, the Nesting definitely takes like a downer approach from beginning to end.
Yeah, it's not really a comical film in that aspect. I'd probably get ridiculed if I didn't mention John Carradine being in this. And John Carradine obviously popped up in a lot of later day horror films, and his performance in this one is pretty solid. He's pretty good in it. Interesting character. He's funny. He does have some funny lines, but that's just because he's a crotchety old man. But he's pretty good in this one.
Yeah, this was probably made while he was on the East Coast shooting The Boogeyman as well. I believe The Boogeyman was shot around the same time, maybe a little earlier. So, making the rounds, seeing which independent production wanted some star power.
I wonder how many cookies and beers they paid John Carradine in this one. So you hear the story on Satan's Cheerleaders where he was too scared to ask for cookies because he just basically was so used to living so poorly on sets that like he didn't ask for anything.
So the other actor of note in this film is Gloria Graham, who plays the Madam, and she basically has like a kind of glorified cameo. She only shows up in a few scenes, and then she has her big scene towards the end where she's explaining who the main woman is, the relationship. But yeah, do you know anything about her?
Not too much. I'd have to look her up on that one. What other roles is she in?
She was like a 40s and 50s Hollywood actress.
Okay.
So this was, like the kind of typical end of the career, slumming it, and whoever is willing to give her a job. So she and there's this. The film was marketed, or not marketed, but like in terms of the fan reception, as like, this is Gloria Graham's last performance, and I was trying to figure out, again, because it was released so long after it was produced, was this actually the last thing that she acted in, or was it just considered that because of when it was actually released? And I was looking at like the other films that she was in that were released around the time, and it might have been the last thing that she was in, especially if it was shot in September or October of '79. The other ones that have been verifiable were all shot earlier in '79. So she died in, I think, '82 or '83. So not long after the film was made, pretty close to when it was released. So yeah, this could have been a nice role again. So there's nothing really worthy about that, and she's from an era of film that I'm not particularly interested in, or at least not the era so much as the type of films. Like, she wasn't. She was a mainstream Hollywood actress. She was not acting in genre films or Poverty Row films or things like that. But yeah, again, how they managed, how the porno producers managed to rope this. I don't know if she ever got like an Oscar nomination or something, but she was a name noteworthy actress, and that's why they made a big deal in the advertising also out of her presence in the film, because out of the John Carradine certainly held a certain degree of weight to a drive-in audience, but Gloria Graham was truly like a big Hollywood star in her day.
It'd be interesting to do the top 10 slumming it roles, or like just the, you know what I mean? That would be pretty excellent. And I mean, the problem is like you'd have to find an actor who's not used to slumming it. So you couldn't like throw Cameron Mitchell because, you know, these guys were in 500 movies like this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's actually a good. I guess you also want to. It would depend on how you wanted to define slumming it, like, you know, Hollywood slumming it versus this kind of slumming it. And I wouldn't even necessarily. I think it's sort of unfair also to describe a film like this featuring an actress like Gloria Graham as slumming it. Like, in her mind, she might have been. But I don't think that there's anything in the film that indicates that they weren't taking the material seriously and that they weren't taking her seriously. But yeah, from the perspective of, you know, she's used to being a big Hollywood contract player to now she's appearing in a movie made by a bunch of porn people. Like, yeah, that's a form of slumming it. But the thing that's actually the most interesting to me is when you'll have really poverty road production. Like, this thing still, I don't know how much it costs, but it definitely cost in the hundreds of thousands. Probably costs maybe upwards of $500,000. So this wasn't, and this, if you think also about inflation from 1979 to today, $500,000 in 1979 is like $2 million. So this wasn't, you know, like a shot in someone's backyard type production. Like, they spent money on it. And the house is actually a landmark. The shot still exists. You can take a tour of it. Yeah, there's effects. There's a decent sized cast. You know, things that clearly show that they were, you know, within their budgetary means. They were pulling out all the stops to make something that felt like a good professional mainstream film. But yeah, there's these movies that occasionally, I can't think of anything offhand, but these, especially the southern ones, like, you know, like, all right, Flesh Feast. You know that one?
1970?
Yeah.
I actually skipped that one from Florida, right? I skipped that one when I did 1970 because honestly, it looked like some of the worst movie that I would have to watch for 1970.
It's, I don't know what else you watched for 1970, but it's not terrible, and it's only 70 minutes. I mean, it's like Nazis trying to do some kind of like Hitler reincarnation with maggots or some nonsense like that. I watched it maybe a year ago, again, after having not watched it probably since I was like 15, and not having any memory of it from when I was 15, however old I was. And I kind of at this time.
It sounds kind of like the 1981 Night of the Zombies by Joel M. Reed, which to me is probably one of the worst movies of 81.
Yeah, I'd put it out, to be honest.
I'd watch it again. I don't know what that says about me. Maybe just because it's on film and it's by a notable director, and it, you know what I mean. It also is Jamie Gillis in that one, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a porn connection.
There we go. So out of these movies here, which movies from 81 do you think stand way above the other ones in terms of quality, in terms of genre movies? This is by Internet Movie Database too, because a lot of these movies, it's really mixed up on what was released and stuff, and widely, it's all kind of a mess, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a big, and this is, I've argued with you about this before. There's always a problem with relying on the internet to decide what when something was made. Yeah, I mean, I think like obvious, you know, must-watch films from '81. Something like The Beyond and Dead and Buried. Those are two respectively masterpieces within their filmmakers' careers. And then I suppose for two more underrated ones, it came up earlier, Butcher Baker, Nightmare Maker, which I was looking at that shortly before I got on this video with you. And yeah, that's just a film that is so well put together and mean spirited, and I love that. Like I love just how nasty and unrelentingly downbeat it is. And then one that I think we talked about the last time that we did one of these in my slashers list or something like that, Night School.
Underrated for sure.
Cannot recommend enough. Like that movie, I'm shocked that it has this kind of middling reputation as a very forgettable, generic slasher. It's really good. Like it's very well directed. It has so much style. It's one of the best American giallo. And
The
with
motives
that,
are good.
what?
The killer's motives are great. They keep you. It can possibly boil it down to a couple possible suspects. The crimes are, the MO is really cool. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and everything is really stylish. I mean, the obvious one to sequence to choose is when the woman's decapitated on the sort of the pseudo merry-go-round thing.
That's right in the opening.
Yeah, but it's everything about like that film is just really good. Like it not on a scale of 1981 horror films. It's just genuinely good.
I think all four of those you picked are on the Video Nasties list in some way or another.
Probably.
I think they actually are. I think Night School and Beyond are, and Dead and Buried, and the fourth one was, geez, why am I Butcher Baker? I think they're both on. All four of those are on the section 1 or 2 list.
Yeah, probably. Well,
I mean, they're
one
great.
that I don't think is on any of them. It's pretty tame, but also really good. The Fan.
It's a good film.
There's something really perverse about it.
It's underlining homosexual stuff going on too with Michael Biehn.
Not even underlying.
It's right in your face. He's clearly got some. He's dealing through some sexual turmoil.
To kill him to steal his identity.
The thing about him, Michael Biehn, I've always felt was a very intense, underrated actor, and I think probably maybe he had some issues because he should have been a star because he was just so good at everything he was in, and I don't know if he had a lot of issues that just pushed him back or something along the lines.
Yeah, and that's the Fan was again a movie that I didn't watch for many years because I would always conflate it with the very mediocre '90s film by the same name.
Oh, the Robert De Niro.
Yeah, and which I suppose I should also probably revisit with fresh eyes. But when
it's been a long time. I was fine with it when I saw it, but I was 10, right?
Yeah. So when I finally watched the '81 film, like it was just so different, and something that I always relate to the extent that I get emotionally invested in movies and their characters and the plight of their characters is when middle-aged to elderly people are murdered. I always feel very like bad about that. Like that's like to me like the meanest thing you can do. Like murdering an old person, much more than kids. Kids kill them all day, but the elderly. I remember there's like a sequence in The Fan where he's basically trying to kill like the elderly assistant of
in the elevator,
maybe, and that's another scene that just stuck out. Like this is like such like a cruel thing to do.
I had the same issue with middle-aged women when they're attacked in movies. I always just associate it with my mother, and I immediately, that just always makes me upset. You know what I mean? Well, then you look at something like Homebodies, where when old people die in that film, anybody in general, it's funny. Which, even though it's very dark, but it's still comedic.
Homebodies is also a pro-elderly film.
Yeah, but it's very funny though. Yeah, but I mean, they turn on each other too. Like, that would be a comparison to like Massacre at Central High. You know, they take care of the enemies, but then what's left but to turn on each other too, you know?
Mm-hmm. Spill tea on the keys.
But I think those movies are actually, they have a comedic bend to them, especially Homebodies, but they're actually darker than a lot of people would give credit to.
Homebodies is also just a sad, and the thing about Homebodies is I love the first half. I think that the first half, when it's all about the plight of being old and alone, before is so effective and resonating. But then when they start turning on each other, it loses a bit of its point, because it's making such a strong and meaningful commentary in like a really clever way about basically, and again, these are things that are still, of course, very relevant today with housing, people getting priced out of their homes, and the threat of developers. So it was just, and Home Buddies is excellent. I mean, I'm not knocking Home Buddies, but it was just disappointing that was the direction that they chose to go, rather than sticking to what had become such an effective point in the first half or 2/3 of it.
It definitely loses some originality, I would say, you know?
So what are your top 81 films?
I spoil my list. Of course, The Beyond. The Beyond is such a strong film. But I like a lot of the typical ones. I like American Werewolf in London. I don't really have an order. I really like The Burning, but I love Dead and Buried. A huge fan. Dark Night of the Scarecrow, House by the Cemetery, stuff like that. Looking down the list myself to refresh my memory. I like sleazy stuff like Nightmare and weird stuff like The Pit. Some underrated ones for me are stuff like Madhouse. I think that's totally underrated film. It's because it's so bizarre, and the Riz Ortolani score from Cannibal Holocaust. One that I was really happy with seeing, I was impressed with it, was Night of the Werewolf. I had never watched that, and I was like, this is a lot more fun than some of the other werewolf movies from this year. And like, there's some stuff that I'm a little down on that I think a lot of people would be surprised. I'm not the world's biggest fan of Halloween 2. I don't think Scanners is Cronenberg's best film.
I agree with you there.
But you know, I typically like Butcher Baker, Nightmare Maker. Happy Birthday to Me is a little underrated. Fulci's Black Cat's underrated. You know, these are better than they get credit for.
When I was in England back in early September, late August, whatever it was, I went to the village where the Black Cat was shot.
Yeah.
Delightful.
Still look the same?
Looks exactly the same.
You would guess that movie's a period piece, almost.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very typical English day, so it started to rain while we were there. So we went into, you know, like the big church with the graveyard.
Yeah.
We went into that church, and we were walking around the church, and there's a pub that's still there that we went into, and yeah, it was absolutely delightful.
I bet.
And Ewan told me, he took me over there, that when he and Stephen Thrower were shooting the location piece, some woman came out of her house and was like, "Oh, what are you doing?" And they said, "Well, we're shooting locations for this movie that was shot here 40 years ago." And she remembered it. She'd been there since the 60s.
So was there that many movies shot there? Because when I watched that one, it sticks out in Fulci's, because Fulci, I mean, some of his movies take place in the UK, but not like that. Not like the classic style Hammer Gothic village. You know, that's just different for him. He has Poe tendencies, but not like that.
Yeah. Well, another thing that really sticks out to me about Black Cat is the score. It has, I think, one of Pino Donaggio's best scores.
Yeah, it's a great score. Very memorable, very different too. It's not Fabio Frizzi. It's not somebody that he typically worked with.
Yeah, but it's very fitting. Like it makes it feel less Italian in a good way.
Yeah, it's definitely going for the British flair. Of course, you got to have it and whatnot. And all the actors in there they're versatile. You know, they're appear in all different sorts of countries, so they almost have, like, although they're from certain countries that we know, they don't have a definitive country associated with them. To me.
Yeah, well, I thought it's also something that's like very Italian, you know, having the international casts, and they don't really fit in any specific demographic or nationality.
So, just in terms of haunted house movies from '81, I guess we'll kind of run down, and you say better or worse. You don't have to give a huge explanation. Is The Nesting better or worse than them? And I lifted this from another podcast I enjoyed listening to. So it's I guess people would say The Beyond, but I don't really consider it a haunted house movie, but it is. It really kind of is. So Beyond.
Beyond is definitely better.
Okay. House by the Cemetery.
Better.
Okay. We'll go Ghost Story.
Similar.
Okay. Then we'll go Ghost Keeper.
Nesting is better.
Okay. I think we brought out of ghost stories in that year. I think there's only the handful of them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it was a very old-fashioned. I mean, especially with something like Ghost Story and the Nesting. The reason I say similar is because, as I was watching it last night, I was thinking, like, this really reminds me of Ghost Story. Like, both movies are about outsiders who come to this town and discover that a bunch of old men have kept this murderous secret for years, and there's in the case of Nesting many angry ghosts. In the case of Ghost Story, one angry ghost who wants to avenge their respective murders.
There are other ghost films, but not in a haunted house aspect. Like, have you ever watched Ghost of Love, which is more of a romantic ghost story from '81?
I mean, I'm sure there's like Hong Kong movies from '81 that have some kind of ghost element.
There's a lot of, some of those ones that you get to the Hong Kong and Taiwan movies. You're like, is it a ghost or is it just complete insanity? I'm not like Gate of Hell. Good luck. That's a vampire film, but who knows exactly what's happening.
Kind of like goofy too.
It's weird. You can tell it's missing 20 minutes. When you watch these movies and they tell you it's an hour and 7 minutes, you're like, there's 20 minutes missing from this.
I watched one yesterday that, I don't know what the real title of it is, but the title in the rip that I watched is Devil Box.
That late 90s or 80?
No, 84.
Okay.
And it's about a guy who's directing TV commercials, and for whatever reason, at the location they're shooting at is a devil box. And like the movie just opens with like, they're preparing for a shot. This one's just like, yeah, move the devil box. And very nonchalantly. And then the devil box activates, whatever that means.
Like that'd be like if you could just live with the lament configuration in everyday life. Like, that's not a thing.
Well, basically, it just starts killing people, kind of, but nothing about it really makes any sense. That we never understand what the devil box is. It's just, it shows up and it floats around sometimes, and it opens, and then there's a bright light comes out of it, and it has great atmosphere, like really beautiful photography, great stolen Tangerine Dream score.
That's very funny about those. Always a stolen score you'll hear and you're like, what is that?
And nothing about it makes sense. It's like a full-on trip film. But there's like, he's like seeing like ghosts of the people who have been killed. It was like so beautiful and so sort of disarming that I enjoyed it, but I have no idea what the point of it was. It never even tries to have a point.
There's one that I watched for '81 that had a lot of similarities to a Dario film, and I'm missing. It might have been called Life After Life. Did you watch that one? It's kind of like a weird reincarnation story. I think it's either Hong Kong or Japanese. And honestly, that one is kind of a hidden gem. I'm double checking on it. I'm looking like a jackass over here, but I just want to make sure the country of origin, because it might be Hong Kong, or it's Hong Kong Cantonese.
Okay. Is it up on Plex?
What was that?
Is it on Plex?
It is on Plex. Yeah, I think you might be interested in it. It's not a perfect movie. It's a little kind of like the reincarnation stuff, and that tended to happen a lot with the Asian films around the time, I'm noticing, or twin acts, a lot of twins and stuff like Island of Evil Soul Spirits and stuff like that.
Yeah, I during the recent Cinemageddon free launch, I downloaded one called Siamese Twins, and I'm sure that's going to be very literal.
What year was that?
I was trying to go for countries that I don't normally get much stuff from, so I just was like choosing Asian countries. So I got a ton of things from Hong Kong. I actually watched one the other day called Evil Black Magic.
I've heard of that. That's 90s.
That's 90s, but it feels like something from the early 80s. And it's directed by the guy who made Black Magic, Black Magic 2, and Oily Maniac.
Oh,
So
so our early Hong Kong guy from this. Those are 70s, late 70s, right?
so he has the same. He was like 70 something years old when he did it. So it has that like more like traditional feel. It's like, you know, like a lot of like wizards and flying. I mean, there's midgets in it. A bunch of midgets pop out of the ground.
So that's kind of bizarre element there, because a lot of that early Hong Kong stuff is almost never gets away from the kung fu element, like Human Lanterns or Heaven and Hell or Shaolin's Gate. They're all like they're almost more martial arts movies than they are horror films, and even like they might go more giallo than horror, like Corpse Mania from '81, but they still have that horror aspect.
Just you and it. The nesting. It's the terror that hides inside your mind. Coming soon.
Yeah, so Black Friday is coming up on the 24th.
Yep.
Yeah, 24th, 12:01 a.m. Eastern time. And yeah, this is a lineup that has been many years, in some cases, in the making. And for me, the two titles that I'm most excited for are Fatal Games, which has already been announced, and hopefully most people watching this are familiar with Fatal Games. It's a very knowingly trashy early 80s slasher that has a great killer twist to reveal. It's a device too infrequently used that is fun every single time, I think.
And you guys actually released a movie that has a similar twist, to be honest. We won't spoil what it is.
Really?
Yeah, Italian. Fatal Games was a movie that they were rumored from Code Red for years, and people were clamoring for this one because it is a slasher, and it's one of the good slashers that never had a DVD release or even much of a release at all.
Yeah, it's also just a really fun film. Like, it moves at a good pace. It has a lot of killings in it. There's a cleverness to. I mean, you know, it's the only movie where everyone dies by javelin. And yeah, there were rumors. I mean, Bill Olsen would constantly talk about how he knew where the negative was, which I do not believe at all, because we checked every single place that it could possibly have been, and it was not there. And Bill would occasionally come through with surprises where he would find stuff that you know, no one knew still existed. And Bill, again, to his credit, he actually was just the 1 year memorial of his death a couple of days ago, 4 days ago, I think. And you know, of course, he and I had our long-standing social feud, but Bill ultimately did a lot in this industry. Yes, he became crazier and more unhinged and less rational and harder to deal with in the last decade of his life. But he does deserve a lot of credit. He doesn't deserve credit for everything that people give him credit for, but he also cannot be denied credit for many things, especially during the early days of Blaster. So this is a big digression. But yeah, he used to claim that he knew where the negative for Fatal Games was, and I am 99% certain he did not. So in early 2020, right before the shutdowns, the national shutdown nonsense, I visited the director's son because this is, sorry, not the director, producer's son. And this is when he was still alive, the producer. And he thought that he cleaning out his dad's house. His dad was in a nursing home, basically ended up his last life. And he said, I think I found the negative. I think I found you film for this movie. And so I rushed over to his house. And fortunately, he didn't know anything about film and then the tapes. So that was very disappointing. So it was a complete lost cause for a while until Guillaume, who runs Pulse Video, which is one of our partners, I was chatting with him about Fatal Games, and I learned sometimes, well, to not go too specific, but we'd had some success in discovering good materials for American movies in various European labs, including in France, because even if they weren't the original negatives, an internegative or positive or CRI or something was frequently sent over to another country to make prints for that country. And like, for instance, the recent Sever release of the last horror film, the negative was the American version, which had some gore shots cut out, and it was released uncut in France. And again, thanks to Guillaume, David was able to track down a film element that in France that included those additional shots, and he was able to therefore reassemble the completely uncut version of the film entirely from film, as opposed to what 88 had done on their previous Blu-ray, which is used video inserts. So I would send Guillaume lists of like, here are movies that we have rights to, or we can get rights to that we don't have any film on, or we have bad ink, or damaged film on. And one of these titles was Fatal Games. Did some research and managed to find an internet Fatal Games at a lab in France, which was kind of major because the only other thing that was known to exist on film for Fatal Games was a print, which was a British print, therefore had been cut for case censorship. So yeah, we managed to get a internegative of Fatal Games, and granted, it's in pretty rough condition, unfortunately. As you can see from the screenshots, it doesn't look anything like the original negative would have looked, of course, but it still looks it's uncut. It's the correct version of the film. It's not. It's finally going to have a release that, unless by some miracle the original negative does turn up, is probably the best the film. It's definitely the best the film has ever looked on video. It's probably the best it's going to look for a long time coming, unless something better turns up. But yeah, this was a passion project for me. It was certainly a passion project for Ewan, who produced all of the extras and really went above and beyond in terms of trying to track people down to interview some of whom were not exactly thrilled to talk about the film. For the most part, everyone was actually proud of it and happy with it. But yeah, every so often you'll mostly with actors, you'll find someone who's like, oh, why do you want to talk to me about that below time career? But wasn't that bad in Fatal Games. But yeah, there also wasn't like a universal celebration of it. But I'm very excited about it. We are all very excited that this film is finally going to have a quality release. And the other film that I'm really excited for is one of the secret titles, which is the early 80s slasher of the two, which is another, it's only ever been released on VHS, looking absolutely abysmal. And in this case, there were prints of it around, and we acquired a couple of prints, and a collector friend had a print, and archive had prints. There were so we knew there were a bunch of prints, and we'd gotten some of them, scanned some of them. We had the rights from the producer's daughter in this case, and she had no idea what happened next. This particular film, the company that released it on VHS had been acquired subsequently by a larger studio. So at one point I asked that studio, do you possibly have anything on this film? And they said, nope, all we have is a video tape master. So we were about to proceed with just using prints and just, scanning a bunch of them, taking the best pieces of each one. And then Ewan, who was again producing the extras for it, noted to me, by the way, I was looking at an inventory for this archive, and it turns out that they have a CRI of it. The CRI is a first generation duplicate element that was commonly used from the very late 60s to the mid 80s. So that was, again, incredible. Like, we managed to get kind of at the last minute, like we didn't even get scans on this thing in August. This is for, a title that's coming out in November. We were able to start restoration on until August. And therefore we managed to get a picture element that looks so much nicer than all these release prints that we were working up. And again, it's not in amazing shape. It still has a lot of damage. It had damage. We've taken a lot of it out. But yeah, this movie is one that I have loved for years. I put it in numerous horror lists, top 10 lists, slasher lists, and so on. Again, it's not a conventional slasher. It's certainly nothing like Fatal Games, where there's like a killer, whether known or unknown, going out, stalking people, killing them. A motive, there's a motive, but it's much more of a tone piece. But it's also quite brutal at times. Has a wonderful sense of place, the use of locations and sets. The sets that takes place, very effective, and director who had never given a certain amount of before was also very excited to be contacted and speak about the film. I was very proud of it.
And I think I know what this film is, and if I remember correctly, the VHS was terrible.
Yeah, well, that's most VHS of it. And this was
worse than usual.
On VHS, pretty shortly after it was released theatrically, and so it's been out of print or released on VHS like 40 years ago.
Yeah, so that's pretty impressive, honestly. That's definitely a checklist one, and one that, if I'm guessing, is probably not talked about too much still to this day, because as we know, if it's not streaming or it's not brand new Blu-ray, nobody knows what they are anymore.
And that's also one of the things that we try to do on an annual basis with the secret titles, both at the halfway sale and Black Friday sale, is have one film which is bigger and better known. It's like the attention grabber because everyone's heard of it. I think we certainly have that with this bigger title, which is a UHD debut with a very noteworthy film by a very noteworthy filmmaker. And again, it's I would say that it's definitely canonical in terms of his. It's in the top 5 to 10 movies that you associate with this filmmaker, probably, and so that will hopefully be the thing that draws a lot of people to looking at what we have coming out during Black Friday, like what's revealed as the sale goes up. But yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, also, you got another big series of films, the Prophecy films, and I'm sure people are interested how you required those, because that, I remember, is Dimension, right? Miramax kind of Dimension, if I'm not mistaken.
So recently we did a fairly large licensing deal with Paramount, which has gotten, I think that between all of the titles that we've licensed from them, we've gotten nearly 40 films. So quite a lot of stuff. And this includes, again, a movie that we'll be announcing it officially soon enough, but again, something that I kind of soft announced on Facebook, which is a wonderful colored Gothic, Italian Gothic, that we're going to be bringing to UHD for the first time ever in January. But yeah, we got a whole array of films from Paramount, and Paramount co-acquired the Miramax library, so they now control the distribution and licensing on a lot of the Miramax library. That's why they're releasing Scream films now and other famous Dimension titles. So we were looking at, what's of interest from Dimension library. The guy who we're working with at Paramount, who I worked with people at a number of studios now, but he's really been a wonderful friend to distributors. I'm not just speaking on behalf of Vinegar Syndrome here. I know that everyone has really enjoyed working with this particular person at Paramount because he is a fan of. He's a big cinephile. He's specifically a fan of genre films, and he really helped us get a good sense of the range of titles that Paramount have in their catalog, so that we were able to get some really incredible stuff. I mean, there's movies that we're going to announce next year, a bunch of Blu-ray debuts, 4K debuts from both Paramount regular as well as Dimension that I think are going to be really exciting to genre film fans, as well as fans of weird and independent, not quite genre stuff from 70s and 80s. So sort of like the like movies more in the vein of Tough Guys Don't Dance.
Okay.
That also picked up from Paramount. But yeah, the Prophecy films came through Paramount. We have, like I said, a number of other Dimension titles. And of course, there's also Prophecy 4, 5, and 6, I think. And we were thinking, well, what are we going to do? Get all of these things and do like this massive box set, or not? And we ended up selecting the first 3 in part because they're the good ones. But no offense to the filmmakers who made 4 through 6, they're fine, I'm sure, but some tastes. But we also wanted to not delve too much into the 2000s era of fiction. And 3, despite having been released in 2000, was made copy. So it was like more comfortable. Like, okay, the 3 90s films, but also the 3 films that Watkins, because after 3, he's no longer involved in the series, and it became the series itself became much more like a sort of Children of the Corn, like, let's very super, or Hellraiser, like those other sort of Dimension, like we want to keep the right to use the name unrelated movies, so we're going to shoehorn the storyline to fit the name that made a sense. So we went with the trilogy because it felt like a true trilogy. Having 4, 5, and 6 with no longer name aside really felt like they belonged. And again, the first 3 are actually quite good. The first one is excellent. Like,
yeah, good films.
As a 90s high concept horror movie goes, The Prophecy is actually one of the more interesting, creative, original ones. And even 2 and 3, which sort of try to rehash some of the things, and of course they're focused much more on Walken. I mean, 2 is definitely focused on Walken. 3 is sort of a secondary character that's still prominent. They felt like a cohesive trilogy, like they belonged together. And again, that was another pretty massive undertaking, because finding good materials, and this is one of the things that's actually been amazing. You always assume, well, movies from the 70s and 80s, like before, and even early 90s, before the age of DVDs and Blu-rays, when everything was theatrical, VHS, television, there would have been less likely to keep negatives or track down where materials were. But we're discovering that there's a lot of movies from the 80s where there's no good material. Like there's a film that we were going to actually license from Dimension, from Paramount catalog. It's like a pretty big, important 90s horror film. And Paramount, again, this is not their fault in any way because they didn't produce the film, they just acquired it in the library. But when they acquired the Miramax catalog, they've told me that Miramax did a horrible job keeping track of the negatives. And for this very big movie, I'm not going to tell the title because we might have to replace it if we can't find music in it. But this is like a huge movie, like tens of thousands of IMDb votes if you want to gauge it in that respect. And they cannot find anything. They don't know what a negative is. They don't even know where inner positive is. They don't even know where a print is. And this is like a movie from the mid 90s. And that in and of itself is shocking. How can something that I was in elementary school when this film came out, how was it lost?
That's strange. That is really strange because that is kind of an underlying thing too. Like people think that nowadays films are going to be easier to preserve because they're hard drives or whatever, but hard drives go quicker than film, really. And they're more delicate.
Yep. Yeah, I have negatives from the 50s that are in immaculate condition, and I have hard drives from 6 months ago that don't mount.
Yeah, it happens, unfortunately. So that's interesting. So as far as the movies that are going to be on sale, is there anything that's going to be on sale here that you would highly recommend for the first time?
You mean like movies that are going to be discounted?
Yeah, for the first time that maybe haven't been before.
Yeah, let me have a look.
Some underrated gems, maybe.
If we're talking just about movies that have come out that will be discounted for the first time during the sale, the ones that I would absolutely recommend to anyone, especially from a horror focus, although they're not all horror, the Villages of the Damned sets, which in part actually came about thanks to you, because you recommended Forest of the Wolf, or Bosque del Lobo.
Great film.
Yeah, and I watched it and I really loved it, so I tracked down the rights, and it turned out that the same company owned rights to a couple other films that were peripherally folk horror. I mean, the point of the set is not folk horror. I mean, it's not. I don't even think that we really push that in the marketing, but effectively that's a collection of 3 Spanish-made films produced between 1969 and Force of the Wolf through 76 Beatriz, which are all sort of folk horror movies. They're all very different tonally. And Force of the Wolf is about local superstition, and it's much more of a character study. And the guy who plays the killer pseudo maiden werewolf, he has a really memorably ugly face, and his performance is equally sympathetic and nasty. And it was one of the best films that I watched, whatever you recommend to me.
Yeah. I recommended that when we were going through 70. The lead in that reminds me kind of like an Eli Wallach or Warren Oates type, but just not as handsome as those guys, I guess you'd say. And they make him ugly on purpose too, but that's based on a true story. So it's kind of like one of these loose horror movies that's based on a true story. And in terms of something like The Frenchman's Garden, or with the Paul Naschy film, which I think is equally as good.
Yeah, and that one made my top 10 of that year of first watches. It's such an impressively done film, and it stays with you. And then the other 2 films in that set, Beatriz is a movie that was made by a filmmaker. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name because I do not speak any Spanish and I don't like butchering non-English names, but he was kind of known for making film, like genre-adjacent films that were much more esoteric and kind of art housey in approach. And I'd seen a couple other films that he made, and I didn't love them. But something about Beatrice is just really nasty. Like someone described it as like a supernatural straw dogs. I don't think that's entirely accurate, although I can see where they're drawing some parallels. But it has this similar sense to Horse and the Wolf, where it's less about whether or not a truly supernatural thing is occurring than the superstition that promotes the belief that it might be supernatural, and therefore the paranoia that comes along with it, and actions that would be taken to stop the supernatural, the potentially supernatural thing. The third film in the set is a really wild one, from the director of what I think is one of the best British movies of the mid '60s, and that's a high praise. And I'm not just saying like British genre films, like one of the, for me, most memorable, impressive British films of the '60s, like Georgieville, which if you have not seen, I would highly recommend. Made by a Canadian guy with an Italian. And this thing is called The Sky is Falling, The Sky is Falling. It came out in the US, in connection with that title, but it came out in the US as a Bloodbath, which is not exactly accurate, but it has, again, a really weird cast. It has Carol Baker and Dennis Hopper. And again, it's not, the supernatural elements here are probably a bit more literal, but the entire film is like a big trip. And it's also very metaphor related. The guys who produced it would go on to produce films by, I believe, both Bigas Luna and Alex de la Iglesia. So,
so that's big.
Their fingers on the pulse of interesting filmmakers working in Spain who wanted to make movies that were very unusual. And this is, I think, the first big film that this producer made. And again, it's like nothing else, and I could give credit here to Charles Devlin, who is a incredible film researcher who, on the Vinegar Syndrome Facebook fan page several years ago, was doing a series of random clips where he would just put up like a couple minutes of like random with no context or title or anything. He put up a clip from this film, and it was just so weird, like especially without context. And I asked him, "What is this movie?" And he told me what it was. And I watched it. It's such a strange and really original, fresh feeling film. That's, again, none of the movies in this set are horror in conventional sense, but they all have elements of supernatural, potentially supernatural murder, folklore, folk horror, local superstition, things like that. And it turned out that the same company owned all three. So it's a perfect set. Anyway, after that really long-winded description, I'll try to be quick for the rest of them. The next one that I would absolutely recommend, again, similar, like what is this type of viewing experience? Infernal Rapist.
That is an insane movie.
Yeah. And again, I can't take credit for discovering, but for finding this movie or watching this movie on my own. This is actually a film that was from Massacre Video, showed me many years ago, and because he loved it. And it turned out that, because we've been getting a whole bunch of Mexican films, and we still have more Mexican films to go. The big problem there, again, is missing materials. We have so many films in license. There's like Geeks, for instance, which just came out a few months ago. second volume of the Cardona set took forever was because we couldn't find anything good in it. So the only thing we located was print. And because Beaks is arguably the most entertaining film Cardona ever made. Probably is. We decided, well, we have to release it, so we took it from the best thing that we could find. But anyway, so Infernal Rapist came from another producer, and he made some really bizarre stuff in the 80s. And it's, again, trying to just describe the plot in terms of a linear narrative doesn't do the film justice, because it's all a tone thing. And there's, ostensibly, it's about a serial rapist who is given demonic powers on the condition that he basically continue raping. And is that an accurate synopsis?
Yes. I mean, like if you said logline, explain this movie to me or sell me this movie, I'm like, it's essentially a Hong Kong movie from the 90s in the most fucked up possible way you can think. But for some reason, it's Mexican.
Yeah, actually, that's yeah. If you like Cat 3 films, and you would prefer them to be in Spanish,
you're dead on.
Yeah, this is that. But there's also killings in it. I mean, there's it's totally wild. And again, I can't remember her name, but the actress who plays like the sort of demon woman who gives him the power, she's great. She's in the films, and she's also in Intrepid as Punks. And she really like chews up the scenery and knows how absurd the character she's playing is, and like has a lot of fun with it.
And they also give like the guy powers, like he's from the mausoleum, which you guys put out. Like he's like essentially has powers like from mausoleum, like lifting people up. It's just giving the worst human being all the power in the world. It's a lot of fun. It's just insane. It's insanely offensive and weird and just entertaining.
And like Hong Kong films, there's colored laser eyes, and
of course,
that's an incredibly apt comparison. It is a Cat 3 film made in Mexico.
I literally thought I was watching it. I was like, oh, I just thought the title alone, and I had heard about the movie for years. I didn't know it was Mexican. So I'm watching 20 minutes. I'm like, this isn't Hong Kong. This isn't a Cat 3 movie. I was like, what is this? Is this in Spanish? And I was just so baffled. I was like, I could have sworn if you would have told me the title and watching some of it, I would have said it's a Cat 3 movie, just without dialogue.
So the last two that I'll suggest for first time on sale titles, I'll make these quick. Another film that we released during our halfway sale, Night Screams, which was a very long time coming. The company that owns it, we worked with them for years, but there was some uncertainties over making sure everything was cleared, but that eventually got all resolved. Films cleared for release, and that's a type of film that I really enjoy because I have a soft spot, no matter how bad or strange or uncommercial they may be, for regional slashers and vanity projects. And nothing Night Screams is a vanity project in the commercial sense, but it was, the guy who produced and wrote it, this was his baby, much more so than the director. Like, he wanted to make film, he wanted to make like a very mainstream commercial Hollywood type slasher in his backyard, and he actually spent a decent amount of money on it, and tried really hard to make a highly saleable commercial slasher. And again, as is often the case with these sorts of films, the tone and the ambiance is just off in a way that makes it more special. Like it even though he's trying his best to make it feel like something that came out of the Hollywood mindset, it still has that we're local, we're making it for ourselves mentality. And then there's the other element of it. In order to make it sellable, he had to beef up the runtime. So he added a bunch of clips from mostly Graduation Day, and then later on some Swedish erotica loops, which are very awkwardly shoehorned in. That's something that he regretted for afterwards. So our edition not only includes theatrical cut with all of the unrelated pieces, but to make him feel like the film is finally seen in a way that is closer to what he intended. We attempted to reconstruct. I don't want to say like we reconstructed the original cut, because the film was never finished with that cut, but we attempted, based on what he explained, what was added, to reconstruct a version which would have been closer to what the film would have been like without all of these additional inserts. So I think that if you've seen the film and you know the film, like the film, like watching it with the graduation day loops, watch that, fine. But I would really encourage anyone, especially if you haven't seen the film, to first watch it in the approximation of the original cut, because I think it's just a stronger film. Graduation day stuff is adding 10 minutes of footage. That's a lot of basically dead space that, when gotten rid of, makes for a much more satisfying and quick-paced experience. And there's also like a ton of killing scenes.
Yeah, I remember there being a lot of oddball kill scenes. The one doesn't somebody there's when somebody's cooking. That scene is pretty memorable. Yeah.
There's a lot of like, and it's another film that it has this reputation of being bad, but I don't understand who can watch graduation day stuff, even if you're like, oh, this is just boring filler. Okay, look beyond that. It's a fun movie. Like, there's no dead space in it. Even the completely ridiculous subplot of the two escaped convicts who hold up and shoot up a diner or gas station and then blow it up. Like, there's so much ambition and entertainment value to be found in the film.
Well, I mean, I'd rather watch a failed, ambitious film than a movie that's ambition is to get in a red box.
Well, yeah. Or our direct-to-Tubi movie. Granted, direct-to-Tubi movies aren't always terrible, but
for sure.
So the like sort of symptom of modern mediocrity. Anyway, the last one that I'm going to recommend, a ESA release from earlier this year, Romano Scavolini's Dog Tags, which is his extremely ambitious, like huge budget, not Platoon ripoff, because they were shooting Platoon at the same time, so he couldn't be ripping off Platoon. It's his kind of after the fact Apocalypse Now caching, made 6 years later. And very, really ambitious and very well done. Huge budget, and helicopter explosions, beautifully photographed, well acted. Not super gory, but there's a few spots that make an impression, like the leg amputation sequence.
It's pretty rough.
Yeah. So that's one that, if you enjoy Scavolini's films, and the extent to which you've seen Scavolini's films is Nightmare and maybe A White Dress for Mariel, I think that Dog Tags is both a nice expansion on what his filmography has kind of been reduced to, which is really just one really gory horror film. And yes, Nightmare has great gore sequences, but otherwise it's very interesting. Like, the movie exists to be a series of gore sequences. The plot is meaningless. There's not really much to be said for creativity in terms of photography.
It's Maniac ran into Halloween.
Yeah.
50% Maniac, 50% Halloween, not done as well as either, but still entertaining. That's Nightmare.
It's fun, and there's no argument. The gore is excellent. All the kills are top notch. Dog Tags is a genuinely serious piece of work. It's the sort of thing that you expect to have premiered at some prestigious festival. Like, it has that level of production integrity to it.
It's weird. I'm going to say this, and this is going to sound super bizarre, but if you were to take Antonio Margheriti's war films and mix them with something a little bit more serious and well made, like William Friedkin's Sorcerer, I would see Dog Tags kind of fitting somewhere in between those movies.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great comparison.
And I love all those movies, so that's good.
We also managed to figure out how to reconstruct both the complete English dub, or not English dub, because mostly English speaking actors, the complete English track as well as the Italian track, and as with a lot of these Italian movies, the version that was released in English-speaking territories was different than the version that came out in Italian-speaking territories. Yeah, so therefore, if you wanted to see it in English, you were going to watch a different cut than if you watch it in Italian. But they didn't shoot alternate scenes; they just cut it down. So we were able to fully reconstruct the totally uncut version, both languages.
That's awesome.
Cut.
So I mean, this movie has been sought. I mean, it's never had a release. No one ever really saw it, which is crazy for how much money you said it costs. And I was impressed with it. I thought it looked really good. It was emotional. It was well done.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, again, like if you enjoy Italian movies of that era, it still has a lot of its Italianness comes through. Like it doesn't just feel like this faceless generic war movie. I don't like war movies. I do not enjoy in any capacity ones. Very few that I can really resonate with. Paths of Glory by Stanley Kubrick is one of the few war movies that I related to, and that's because of it, more of a downer character drama.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the whole, stomping around the jungle unless cannibals or zombies show up, I don't have an interest. And Dog Tags is compelling. It's long, it's like about 2 hours long, but it's compelling. It's so well made. It's probably better made 90% of the Italian films of any genre coming out of the time.
Yeah. Especially the war films, because the war films are fun and entertaining and big explosions, but they don't. Some of them do try to capture that that feeling, like Cannibal Apocalypse or Last Hunter do have something to say, but Last Hunter comes across as more of a deer hunter kind of style thing and not its own thing. But I mean, nonetheless, this is a good film, different, but still good.
I'm curious, what have been the 2023 Vinegar Syndrome releases that you've enjoyed the most, especially if they were first watches?
Oh boy, I'd have to look at the list. I'm terrible lately. I did. Here's one off the top of my head that is very funny to me because for 20 years, everyone's like, Killer at 10 Lake. What is it? Killer at 10 Lake? Or
Terror at 10 Killer.
Yeah, everyone's like, it's the worst slasher I've ever seen. Worst movie ever. So I put it in, I watched it, and I was like, I like this. I imagine this is a different cut, the original cut. And that song was stuck in my head. Mine, oh, mine. I actually enjoyed the movie, and I listened to that song occasionally, and I just was surprised with it. Like, I'm tired of the slasher movies are the ones that people say are shit, are usually from the 80s, are usually still good.
Yeah. Yeah, one that though I cannot get behind at all is Killer Party. I hate that movie. I don't know.
Does it make? I never liked it when I saw it. I have to rewatch it, but it's all over the place.
Yeah, and The Burning. I know you had it on your top 10. I do not like The Burning. I've warmed on it just a little bit, but there's something that even in 80, shot in 80, came out in 81, that even by then felt so thoroughly generic in like a thankless way. Like they're something like Madman, which is clearly just a Friday the 13th ripoff, like in every respect. Like, so sure, they're just basically making it's essentially Friday the 13th Part 2 before Friday the 13th Part 2, Friday the 13th ripoff. At least they're having fun with it. At least it has like these weird elements. The Burning is thankless. Like, and I remember the first time I ever watched it, I liked the opening. Like, oh, this is like an interesting premise. I like that it's like 42nd Street, and they have that sort of nightmare type vibe where it's like sleazy Times Square, hooker killer, and then it just goes to this boring, generic summer camp. The Landers.
I think what stands out for The Burning for me is I like the characters, and they actually look like kids. which is a rarity, which is what Friday 13th Part 2 actually has going for it when you compare it to a lot of the other Friday 13ths. The characters are solid in terms of the slasher, but so is My Bloody Valentine. So is Happy Birthday to Me. They have solid characters. I think when you get away from the early 80s, you start getting really crappy characters, but you get some maybe more ridiculous kills. But I've always been a huge fan of The Burning, and I have not rewatched it in a long time. It's still one I have to rewatch for 81. So maybe I won't feel as strong about it. But by the time you get to that, and that year, you have what? How many campfire stories did you have? You have Friday 13th, 2, you have Madman, you have The Burning, everybody standing around a campfire. And then on top of that, you have stuff like Just Before Dawn, like a lot of woods and stuff like that.
Yeah. So, all right, what are your worst so far?
Night of Horror.
Okay, that's fair.
Night of the Zombies.
Okay.
Some of them I went ahead and did something really dumb where I tried AI subtitles, but I didn't run it at that large base, like the huge base. So I'm getting really crummy subtitles on there. So it's hard to rate that kind of stuff. But there was a couple movies I wanted to see for a while, like Yarshi, the giant, the evil giant, aka like Para Ratnari, and that was Thai. And like it's not great, but the problem is because the subtitles were terrible, but I don't know exactly if that's just the me and two not liking it. But as far as low ratings are concerned, we have Night of Horror, Frankenstein Island, Saturday the 14th, Night of the Zombies. I don't care for any of those. I really don't like Saturday the 14th. I just think it's crummy. It's not funny. It's just late. It's just so soulless.
Yeah, most of those are pretty bland. Like, and there was also this glut of horror parodies at the same time, like Whack, which I released, which is all right. I mean, it's certainly better if it's R-rated than its PG version. But yeah, there's that one.
Student Bodies. I love Student Bodies.
I don't. I think there's some surprises in Student Bodies that make it maybe a little bit more interesting. But it was just so dumb.
Saturday the 14th to me is bottom of them, though, no matter what. There's some ones that I'm a little harsher on than I should be. Dawn of the Mummy, I don't love, which I should. It should be right up my alley. Striglata, Wolf, the Indonesian Friday 13th, I don't love. One that's actually, the second half is really great, but the first half is so inept and crummy and the acting's bad, is Fear No Evil.
Yeah, I don't love Fear No Evil.
Me either.
I rewatched it within the last year. I don't remember why. And yeah, it there's something kind of amateurish about it.
Yeah, it's just it's very inept. Almost like the story never came together. Faces of Death 2 is pretty poor in comparison to the first one.
So Faces of Death 2 and 3 are
real footage.
Depending on which version you watch, you're going to see different movies.
Really?
So Faces of Death 2 and 3 were both highly re-edited in the US. The original versions of both, I hate Faces of Death 2. I think that Faces of Death 2, like the first one I like. First one
Me
I
too.
think is a really good, interesting film. Also in part because I think that the score actually works really well. And it does a nice job of blending the fake stuff and the real stuff. Faces of Death 2 has a few interesting moments. Like I like what was it, like someone like jumps off of a building, and that's like a big simulated scene where it's also like a homeless section that I think is interesting.
There's a robbery that is clearly made for it that's really poorly done.
But the animal violence, like the real animal violence in 2, unlike in the first one where it's like slaughterhouse footage, the real animal violence in 2 just seems cruel in ways that immediately turn me off.
And it's also way too late to be doing like the Mondokani style thing where they just get a bunch of footage and narrate over whatever they want. And Faces of Death 2 seems like they just got B-roll of news footage that they couldn't put on there and just narrated over it. It's just a patched together crummy piece of shit. Cash in to me. That's what it felt like. Well, Mondokani has excellent, cinematography at least, and a great score, and it was groundbreaking for the time. Well, this one is just way too late to be doing this stupid shit, and it's ugly.
Now, the original cut of Faces of Death 3, which is just called Fear,
yeah,
was actually quite fun.
Really?
And it's like it has nothing to do with the, well, I mean, it has like some real death stuff, but it's much more about death as a concept. So there's like sequences with mediums and clairvoyance and.
Is that Journey into Fear as well?
No, not Journey into Fear. So Faces of Death 2 and 3 were made simultaneously, and 2 was supposed to be a Faces of Death movie, whereas 3 was not supposed to be a Faces of Death movie. It was just going to be called Fear, and it came out in Europe as Fear, but then MPI, which had the video rights on all of them, retooled Faces of Death 2 and made it about 20 minutes shorter than the original. Like the original version of Faces of Death 2 is as long as the first one, but the video version is like 5 minutes. And then they took sections from 2 and then completely retooled 3, because 3 or Fear did not have Dr. Gross in it. So if you look at 3, what the American releases, the Dr. Gross segments are all shot on video. Wow. With the exception of a couple which came from Faces of Death 2, because they took some of the stuff out of Faces of Death 2 to create a fake Faces of Death 3 while taking out all the supernatural stuff from Fear.
What a mess. So are you guys ever going to do a box set of all of
them? Sadly, I do not think that's in the cards.
I appreciate you coming on and talking about The Nesting, 1981, and Black Friday. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, don't think so. Actually, one final thing, I suppose. I feel like the VSA releases this year are going to be hopefully extra exciting for people who are interested, both American indie horror as well as Hong Kong.
That's awesome. Yeah, big in the Hong Kong stuff. I mean, you can catch patterns on when they get released and stuff like that, you know, through DVD, when all the Hong Kongs got DVD, and then now we're in that cycle for Blu-ray, which is exciting because a lot of stuff that's never been put out is getting put out.
Yeah, I'm trying to unearth more of the Hong Kong horror stuff. Like, yes, the action has its audience and they do well, but it does not excite me to release a bunch of 90s action movies.
No, those are great movies, but
yeah, some of them are very good, but I would much rather be releasing weird 80s horror things.
There's a lot in the early 90s. The list is on, it never stops. I mean, from Bloody Beast to so many different movies, you know.
Yeah, I've just downloaded like 100 of them to watch and beef up my knowledge.
But the funniest thing is, after the Untold Story, or actually after Dr. Lamb, everybody rushed to make all these like based on true story, really violent, rapey Hong Kong horror movies. And you got Bloody Beast, you got Daughter of Darkness, you got the Untold Story, and Ebola Syndrome, and half of them star Anthony Wong, but they're all just big rape fests. The ones that interest me is the weird one where it was based on the serial rapist in Hong Kong who would rape all the people in the apartment buildings. And there's a little Red to Kill in that too. You know, Red to Kill has some of that in there. But there's like 2 movies made the same year, the year after the person was caught, the serial killer. And it's just such a weird.
I watched a based on true story, like a apparently true one, a few days ago called The Intruder.
Yeah, I've heard of that. 98? That's late 90s, 97.
Yeah. It felt older though.
Yeah, of course.
Also has some expectedly like really nasty violence in it, but it's a different tone. It's, once, do you know what it's about?
No, I know it's a female killer, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, she's holding this random guy hostage, and we don't know what for. And then eventually, when we find out, there's like a really like effective macabre element to that I think is worth going in blind on.
Oh, I mean, like it could go 2 ways. It could go straight up hard candy, or it could go straight up flashback and do the whole big flashback. Those Hong Kong movies are always about the flashback reveal.
There's a little bit. This has flashbacks in it, but it doesn't have a flashback reveal. This one, the surprise comes very out of left field, but it's also very
Oh, sounds interesting. I mean, hopefully you guys can get those. I mean, like I said, don't sleep on the Hong Kong movies, especially from 1970 to 2000. They're all pretty crazy and interesting stuff.
All right. Well, I think have we covered everything?
I think we're good. Thanks again.
Yeah. Same.